Hi, hello, welcome back. My name is Devraj and welcome back to this series about Reichian character structures or Reichian character analysis. Originally conceived in the 1920s and 30s, it's in many ways kind of dropped out of view, but there's an immense wealth of useful information in this practice. And for me, it's been a really great journey, rediscovering some of this work, having done a little bit of it about 10, 15 years ago, to go much more deeply into it and to look at some of the character stereotypes and how they still exist in the world. So far, we've been looking at some of the pregenital structures, as they're called, the oral and the masochist or endurer, people for whom invasion or abandonment wounds in the case of the oral and invasion wounds in the case of the endurer, generally go in very, very early in life, like before 15 to 18 months of life. And then we moved on to the rigids, and there's a whole series of rigid character structures. We're going to be looking, I think, at 4 of them. So far we've done the Phallic Narcissist, the classic Western male, but in many ways the kind of systematic aspects of traumatization that go on in the West, in the Western childhood, are intended to create a certain number of phallic narcissists to help the culture keep moving forwards in a certain way. And likewise, the so-called hysterical female, not a very good title if you ask me, but the kind of archetypal Western woman. And again, created rather by the culture as a means to continue, perpetuate itself and to move forward and to retain certain qualities. And now we're going to look a little bit more at the underbelly, in a sense, with the passive feminine male. Because I think it's fair to say that Western culture, does not really set out to create. If there was some kind of overlord of Western culture, he or she does not really set out to create passive feminine males, but they come along the way, and they are also, interestingly enough, a rigid subtype. They're a subtype of the rigid character structure. So let's have a look. We're going to do the symptoms, some of the psychology, physicality, and therapy. How we can create change, or how someone who's got these traits can create change. And something to mention first of all, as I have done before, is that it's rare to meet someone who's purely in one of these categories. So it's more accurate or rather more useful to say, how much of this personality do I have inside of me? And then to understand, okay, where does that maybe come from, and how can I move it out of my system if I want to? And of course, for passive feminine, it's very much in view these days. 2020. There's been the Me Too movement. There's been a lot of people trying to work out how men and women should now be in this kind of Generation Z kind of thing that's going on. And back in the 90s, a great guy, Dr. Robert Glover, a psychotherapist in the United States, wrote a book called No More Mr. Nice Guy. And he kind of started a whole long dialogue off, which is still continuing now, with the idea of the nice guy, someone who's been socially conditioned into, away from their kind of natural raw masculinity and into this nice guy persona. And, that has inspired a lot of people in this scene. And I think the first question to ask is, when we consider the Reichian notion of the passive feminine man, which also stretches back into Freudian psychology and very early, around 100 years ago, is it essentially the same as the nice guy? And, in some ways it certainly is, in my opinion. The nice guy is the passive feminine to a degree, but it's important to understand that Dr. Glover's work was more looking at kind of social psychology, and with Freud and with Reich, you're looking really deep into the character, deep into the genetic structure in a way, and deep into the trauma that's gone on and the body and the mind's response to the trauma. So, this is deep stuff. This is deep stuff. The deepest kind of layers of character that we have are the hardest to shift, and they exist on multiple levels of our psyche, multiple levels. So having said those having got that out of the way, that really, the nice guy thing is a paradigm. It's a way of looking, and character analysis is a paradigm. It's a way of looking at people. It is not that is definitively, objectively correct. It's just a useful mechanism to look at people and to study. Let's take a look at the passive feminine male. The classic symptoms that you will see with someone like this is a kind of smooth, unlined face, quite a feminine face, and a soft voice. The voice will definitely lack the kind of depth of the belly, that raw animal kind of intensity that comes out of, the unrestrained masculine voice. They have quite a gentle manner. They may have exaggerated politeness or be a little bit fake humble. They could be a bit over friendly, getting a little bit close too soon, something like that. There generally will be a lack of kind of assertion. In their bodily movements, they're not very assertive. They are more passive. They may well be shy and find it quite a struggle to be in front of a group. There may be, and generally, fear is the kind of dominant emotion, or fear is not strictly an emotion, more like an energetic gap that exists around emotions, a kind of a holding area that we get caught in. And fear does tend to dominate them, often to the point where they may be quite phobic. They may have suffered quite a lot of phobias and may be worried about all sorts of stuff which may appear a bit irrational. They often have quite a strong reaction to authority, but it tends to be submerged and, not so much that they get into the face of authority and really challenge, but in the background they're like, fuck you. That's their kind of position. They can be quite manipulative or cunning. I don't think that's such an important feature, but that can be in there. There may be also, a kind of fascination with women in the female body or aspects of the female body. There may be a desire to be a woman somewhere inside. They tend to suffer tiredness quite a lot and a lack of enthusiasm for life. They can be quite hard working, but it can be difficult for them to really on any level to take a position for themselves and say, hey, this is what I really want to do. That underlying ego aggression, and in psychological language, ego aggression, assertiveness is a positive quality. It's not about being an aggressive motherfucker to people. It's basically feeling, hey, I can move out towards people and get my needs met. That tends to be lacking. They don't necessarily tend to suffer a lot of anxiety, and you can contrast those with the endurer or masochist, who with that strong pregenital invasion wound, they tend to have high anxiety and live in a world of a lot of conflict. The passive feminines tend not to be, though they have many of the traits of the endurer. They don't come from the same place psychologically in terms of their childhood and what's gone on, and they don't tend to have the anxiety. Psychologically and childhood, there tends to have been a dominating mother and perhaps a rather nervous or submissive mother. And what often happens is that they're kind of trapped, the passive feminine, when the early genital stage came on, like age 4 or 5, the dominating father scared them and they didn't, jump up to be a guy. And they also didn't fight the dominating father, either physically or mentally. They kind of retreated. They didn't totally retreat into just being completely submissive and oral. They've got the fire in there, but there isn't enough of it to really move them forwards to create a properly formed assertive ego, And so they are kind of caught in a little bit of a waiting room in life, in between certain key stages of development. So they tend to collapse in the face of a father's authority, as opposed to, say, the Phallic Narcissists, another rigid subdivision. Those guys are going to fight. They're going to fight. If not physically against the dad, mentally, I'll fucking show you, dad. Maybe by becoming successful, or maybe just in oppositional politics, whatever. But there's that fight there. Sometimes this anger against the dad is so repressed, it tends to get more projected onto women, and they can be quite nasty towards women sometimes. Another thing that you may see with the passive feminine is that they become gay. It's possible that because for some level the masculine aggressive thing is sensed as not really not okay, and there's a lot of fear around it, in order to get sexual needs met, they may simply become gay. And, it's complex. I'm not an expert on gay psychology and gay character analysis, but, just as there are men who clearly have quite a lot of gayness in them and are very scared to own it and act, artificially macho, I could mention some, when I was in subculture, there were quite a lot of men around the skinhead scene and stuff like that when I was a punk, who definitely seemed to me to fall into that category. Likewise, there are men who are gay in their behaviour, but it is more a pattern of behaviour to get needs met and may not reflect the true world of their inner sexuality. In love relationships, this is quite interesting with the passive feminine. It is difficult for them to be in a normal one-to-one relationship with a woman. They tend to either find younger women and act a bit the father role, or find older women and act a bit the child role. This is quite commonly seen, and it is not easy for them just to take on a normal male role. As mentioned before, there tend to be phobias, and these are a manifestation, again, of this basic lack of ego assertiveness, or what was traditionally called in psychology aggression. The basic belief, hey, I can move forwards to what I want. Yes, they live in this kind of paralysis. There may be a desire to be a woman. In the old days of Freudian and Reichian psychology, castration anxiety was common with them, I don't know if that's so something people talk about very much these days. Physiology. Let's have a little look at the physiology of the passive feminine male. Like I said, this kind of soft, smooth, unlined face is very common, a very gentle face. Soft hands also. What's also interesting, on a Reichian, on a bioenergetic level, is they often are quite flexible in their body. They may have high body flexibility and have quite a soft body, contrast to Phallic Narcissists, who tend to be very tense and always kind of ready to attack or defend themselves. The passive feminines, although they're from a rigid background, that tension, that conflict tends to be buried much deeper inside the muscle system. And this raises, a wider point that people often are interested in bioenergetics, in that simply because you're very flexible in your body does not really mean that you're in contact with your feelings. Does not really mean it. Passive feminines are a classic example of people who may be very flexible physically, but who can't really engage with their feelings. Everything has been submerged deep below the surface. They may suffer premature ejaculation as part of their basic sort of phobic thing, and there may be low energy in the pelvis. Again, this is a sign of the difficulties moving forwards of being assertive. Okay, so having gone through all the negatives for the passive feminine male, let's have a little look at the kind of treatment avenues that they can go down, and how they can create change. The first thing to say, like the endurer, the masochist, they often are up for therapy and are quite compliant with therapy, and they will go through the motions of it, but it is not easy for them to really engage with the feelings. So as a therapist initially, it seems like the passive feminine is really on board and up for it, but after a little while through the sessions you start to realize they're kind of doing it, but they're not really giving it. And this is the core kind of issue that they have. The aggression, the deep emotions are buried deep inside, and it's difficult to get to them. So, the treatment, you can expect that if you're from this background, or if you're a therapist working with people, the expectation is slow, gradual progress rather than a sudden shift. Is not so likely. The aggression has been buried deep, and it is difficult to find it, and it needs to be found. There will be a lot of anger against men. There may be on the surface anger against women, but underneath that, anger against men, against macho type of men, and usually, of course, the father. And that is buried deep. But, for someone who's passive feminine, if they can get to that anger, then it's really going to move them quick. If they can really feel it, and they may have to fake it till they make it for quite a long time. And this is quite contrasting to the other rigid stereotype 3.1, the Phallic Narcissist. For these guys, they don't so often go to therapy, but once they do go to it, the stuff is on the surface. Everything is on the surface. It's right there in the surface of their muscle system. The rigidity, you can see where they're held. If they start to scream, a lot starts to move quite quickly. For the passive feminines, it will be tricky. Like I said, if you can get to anger for someone from this background, that is really going to support them. Also, the legs can be quite weak, working with the legs in the gym or with bioenergetics to get the back of the leg muscles open, or rather the muscles at the back of the leg, can really support them. Working with the belly can be good with this like right to exist exercise that you'll find in my bioenergetic YouTube channel. That can really get this kind of pre-verbal core kind of aggression starting to go again. And by aggression, I mean, feeling the right to move towards things and to get needs met. So that can be useful. Working at a throat level is also very strong with passive feminines. Stuff like gag reflex, stuff like any level of sound, natural sound from the throat. Being able to just make as much noise as they can is very, very useful. Generally, they will need to keep releasing to the point of exhaustion. And in sessions, this is normally where you go with people from this kind of background to support them to go as deep and to clear stuff up. Likewise, we said, the belly, the throat, generally anger. And, sometimes for these guys, working in a group can be useful. Sometimes with passive feminines, it's like they're not as deeply traumatized as the orals or the endurers. And, just being in a group context, sometimes different aspects of their personality come out quite quickly. If, they're around other weak kind of people or people they perceive as weak, they may suddenly jump up and take a dominant role and suddenly find themselves, contrary to their expectation, flying into a kind of alpha male state. It can happen. And this can be made use of in group therapy. In a group, they may start to find it easier to come into different roles and to move forwards. Okay, I'm just checking my notes. I think that's about all I've got to say about the passive feminine subtype. Like I say, it's just good to look. It's parts of me that are in there as well. I've got the passive feminine living inside of parts of me, just as I have oral endurers and phallic narcissists, no doubt about it. It's in all of us, and it's just interesting to look, to take in some of the information. I'm also going to be giving some written information on my website. And, you can work in these fields with the throat, with the legs, with anger, with belly exercises. If you're interested in characterology and you want to go deeper, there's a whole many weeks of it basically in the Bioenergetics for Journey course. So do check that out. It's at bioenergetics.org.uk, my website on bioenergetics. Okay, guys, thank you for tuning in. If you're passive feminine, it's okay. It's okay. The core thing is if you want to change it, over time you can change it. You can change it. There's nothing really blocking you. Okay, guys, over and out. Have good times, and I will speak to you soon.